I also have no problem with anybody who isn't a fantasy fan. If you're not a big fan of fantasy and that's just not your jam, that's awesome. I am totally not suggesting at all that you are 100% missing out. Maybe a little. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. It's Tori, and today we're going to be talking about something that I have been percolating on for a long time because I wanted to be able to articulate it. We'll see if I succeeded or not. And this is kind of a question that I've created based on a lot of comments and or questions that I have heard from other people over the years. And it's kind of encompassing this whole idea into one question. And then I'm going to break it down and we're going to talk about it. And essentially the question is, should you actually read fantasy novels, or is it just kind of this frivolous escapism that doesn't really teach you anything helpful? Now, I realize that this may sound completely ridiculous to those of us who read fantasy on a regular basis, but I really wanted to be able to articulate why I have a problem with that idea. I even had a discussion with somebody at one point who said that they didn't want to read any fantasy because they didn't want to waste their time with books that aren't going to teach them anything. And immediately I kind of had to pull myself in for a second and say, ooh, I have a problem with that, but why? Why do I have a problem with that statement? And I want to be able to actually have a discussion about why fantasy as a genre is so much more than just escapism. Now, I think for starters, we have to definitely say that this whole concept of fantasy being a frivolous genre, or a genre that can't really teach us anything about the world we live in, is kind of rooted in the underlying assumption that fantasy is completely detached from reality as a genre. And you know, because of the name, I think a lot of people who are not familiar with fantasy or haven't read a lot of fantasy kind of immediately have that, oh, it's fantasy, so that means that it's like, you know, completely detached from reality and there's nothing really useful in it for people who live in the real world. Okay, so I think we really need to break this down before we go any farther. And this is what I want to suggest. I think that there are kind of two types of relatability to any kind of book, whether it's contemporary, fantasy, historical fiction, etc. You have the internal relatability that comes from your characters, and you have the external relatability that comes from the world that your characters are in. Now, while the external relatability is going to change depending on what kind of a genre you are in, whether it's rooted in the world that we live in, or if it's a place that has been created out of the author's imagination, the internal struggles of the characters, the relationships, what characters want and what resonates with them, the basic human condition, if you will, doesn't change between genres. These books are going to raise the same questions about humanity and the relationship of us to each other and us to the world we live in as any contemporary fiction would. And in some cases, I would argue, provide a much bigger platform to look at a lot of very heavy issues all at once. I think some other questions that kind of come out of this idea are things like, can you learn anything from a culture that isn't your own? Obviously, yes. Can you become friends with someone who doesn't speak your language? Obviously, yes. Can you be inspired by a place that you've never been to? Obviously, yes. Even if you look back at our own history, there are so many cultures and empires and societies and people that we have been able to be inspired by and learn from, even though they, for all intents and purposes, came from a completely different world than we do. Now, to be fair, I grew up loving reading and writing fantasy, so for me, it doesn't feel as foreign as it does to a lot of people that are not as familiar with the genre. And I completely understand that it's a genre that does take a little bit of practice to get into, especially when you don't have the background or foundation of growing up with it. Also, because I'm a character-driven reader and writer, I definitely connect with what's inside the characters as opposed to the external world a lot faster. So for me, it's not as much of a stretch to jump into a character who comes from a world that I'm not used to, because I'm connecting with what's inside the character first. I'm trying different parts of lighting here. I'm not, okay. You know what? we will just eliminate the glare and we will put the glasses on top of the head and see if that is an improvement. And if it's not, we'll just... Any book in any genre should do a number of things. We write to entertain people, to give them a good time, to give them a little bit of a break from their day, escape from their daily life, to expose them to new ideas. And again, this is not limited to any specific genre. Any book and any author can help you do this. There's a great quote, and I cannot remember for the life of me who said it, but it is, "Art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable." I absolutely love that quote because I feel like it's so powerful and so true, and it kind of covers both the relatability, which is the comfort. It gives us something to relate to and say, oh yeah, I know what that feels like, and at the same time it challenges us to come outside of our comfort zone and learn something new about the world we live in or the person that we are. And when it comes to the world of fantasy, one of the things I think is really interesting is that the world of fantasy or sci-fi really... The world of fantasy and all of its subcategories, it really excites my wonder and imagination, and it's very inspirational, and it kind of appeals, I think, to that part of all of us that exists in childhood that is a creator, a world builder, an imagination-focused dreamer. And so many adults talk about, when do we lose that? And for me, fantasy is a great way to go back and re-access some of that childhood wonder and imagination that we kind of start to lose as we become more and more entrenched in our world. My last point with this that I want to make is that oftentimes with fantasy, I think it's easier to form an objective viewpoint about issues, whether that's, issues of internal or external, how people treat each other, or something inside you as a person. I think it's easier to form objective viewpoints on a lot of these issues because they're so polarized when you take them out of our world and put them in a world that is different than ours. Which, it's, in order to have personal growth, we need to be removed from a comfort zone. That's kind of a prerequisite. It really provides a strong emphasis on the internal struggles that are happening with the characters and their relationships, because there is a contrast in your familiarity with the world around them. Oftentimes when we think about the world that we live in and what we're familiar with, we've kind of grown complacent and we just have accepted certain things because they are in our everyday routine, they're outside, they're everywhere. And one of the things I love about fantasy so much is it kind of challenges us because it throws us into a world that is very different from ours, but at the same time there's enough similarities that we can say, oh yeah, I've definitely seen this, or I've definitely struggled with this. So it's a really good way to examine, I think, humanity as a whole. I'd be very interested to know what any of you guys would have to say about this particular topic. It's something that I'm very passionate about, and I think it's really interesting to have this discussion. So I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments, and remember to keep it respectful, obviously. If you haven't already subscribed to my channel, go ahead and join us because we would love to have you here. And I hope you guys have a really good day. I hope this was an interesting video, and I will see you all in the next one.